Many of the visual components we create in Angular are going to have child components, and this can get very complex. We need a way for parents to communicate with their children, and we need a way for the children to communicate with their parents. This way we can pass information back and forth among components. The primary way we do this in Angular is with input and output decorators. Let's look at how we work with these. Let's say we have a parent component called org-chart component, and this is going to display an entire org chart, but we'll just show one child here called app position. This would be one job position in the org chart, and we're setting the title attribute to CEO. Now in our position component, this uses the selector app-position, but to keep things simple, I'm just showing the class here, which has a title of type string. So we want to take this title of CEO and populate this title in the position component. Will the child title property be set to CEO? No, it won't. We need to use a decorator. And in this case, you can see we're using the @input decorator on title. And by specifying @input, this allows our title value to come through. Will the child title property be set to CEO? Yes, we're doing everything properly now. Our parent can communicate to its child by setting title equal to CEO right here. But this is a more common case. We would want to use property binding. We want the Angular compiler to work with data. Now, if you remember our positions array, that had 3 items in it, and the first item had a title of CEO. So that's what we're accessing right here, and we're binding that to title. Will title be bound properly? Yes, it will. So property binding doesn't only work with DOM elements, it works with our own custom elements, as we can see here. Now here's a common problem we run into. We're binding the string CEO to title in square brackets. Will title be bound properly? No. CEO is not a property of org-chart component. So remember that when we use square brackets for this property binding of title, the Angular compiler kicks in, and it's going to treat CEO as an expression. It's going to look for a variable on org-chart component. And that's not what we intend. So to make this correct, we would just take the square brackets off. And here's another aspect to this that we need to be aware of. So let's say we're setting title equal to CEO. We want CEO to be passed through into position component. But there was some refactoring done on position component, and there's no longer a property called title. It was renamed to internal title. How do we get the title binding to set internal title? We create an alias. Of course, one thing we could do is go throughout all our source code and rename everything to internal title, but it's much easier to create an alias, and let's see how we do that. Here's the alias. Our input decorator now is passed title as a string. So this title will match up with the title here in the parent's template. But within position component, it gets renamed to internal title. And this works fine. So that's how we work with sending information to a child component. And we've been working with strings, but it could be any object that we pass along to the child. Now let's look at an example going the other direction. We have our org chart component, and it has a child component app position right here, but we want to specify an event. We'll call the event custom event. We'll do an event binding with the parentheses, and we want to call the function on custom event in org chart component. Let's assume that exists. But in our position component now, we have a custom event, but it's not set up properly. We don't know what the type is, and we don't know that it's some kind of object that can fire an event. How do we set up custom event in the child? We use @output and create an event emitter. Let's see that in action. So we use the @output decorator, and the property name is custom event. We set that to a new event emitter, and we're passing it a generic type of null. So we're going to emit an event, but there's no parameter that we need to pass along. That's why the generic type is null. How do we fire the event? We need to call custom event.emit. And here we have an example of that. When a button gets clicked, we'll call this .customEvent.emit. And again, we don't have to pass it any value because we set up our event emitter as null. It doesn't take any parameters. How do we emit a string value? We set up the event emitter to take a string generic parameter. And let's see that. We're setting custom event equal to a new event emitter of string. And then when we call custom event.emit, we pass it whatever string value we want to emit. And another important part of this is that in our app position component up here, we get access to that string in the built-in $event variable. So we call onCustomEvent, passing it $event. So communicating between parent and child components is simple. To go from a parent to a child, we use an input decorator. And going from a child back up to its parent, we use an event emitter. We use the output decorator, and we create a new event emitter of whatever type we need to pass back to the parent.